It was late July of 1943, inside a crumbling stone arsenal outside Palermo, Sicily. The air smelled of cordite and dust, the way every Italian workshop did in the third year of a war that had long since turned against them. A small group of Italian Army ordnance engineers gathered around a wooden crate marked with English stenciling, property of United States Army. Their prize had arrived from a captured American position near Gela, delivered by a retreating German liaison officer who thought the Italians might find it useful. To most of them, it was just another rifle to be catalogued, examined, and filed away. To Colonel Enrico Marini, Chief Small Arms Inspector at the Palermo Arsenal, it was an opportunity to prove that Italian bolt-action rifles, refined over 5 decades, were superior to whatever crude machinery the Americans had rushed into production. He had spent 20 years working with the Carcano M1891, believed nothing could match the elegance of a properly engineered bolt mechanism. "The Americans build for quantity, not quality," he said to his team, his voice echoing through the half-destroyed workshop. The others nodded quietly. They had seen the photographs, heard the rumors, soldiers carrying some kind of automatic rifle that seemed to defy the basic principles of infantry doctrine. They were certain they would find compromises inside. Weak springs, fragile parts, evidence of shortcuts taken to meet production quotas. To them, American design was industrial desperation disguised as innovation. The crate was pried open under the weak afternoon light filtering through shattered windows. Inside lay the rifle like a relic from a different war. Walnut stock, dark metal, heavier than expected. Even scratched and dented from combat, it seemed to radiate a quiet confidence. Marini lifted it slowly, feeling the weight. 9.5 pounds, nearly 2 pounds heavier than a Carcano carbine. "Excessive," he murmured, running his hand along the barrel. "They waste steel like it grows on trees." His assistant, a younger engineer named Lieutenant Paolo Rossini, scribbled notes in a ledger. They recorded the serial number, the manufacturer markings, Springfield Armory. None of them noticed the silence that followed when Marini set the rifle down on the bench. Outside, Allied bombers droned in the distance, an irony none of them acknowledged. Marini ordered the team to examine every component. Bolts were measured, the action tested, the wood inspected for cracks. When the first clip was inserted, a strange metallic sound echoed through the room. 8 rounds loaded at once from a single piece of formed steel. "Look at this feeding system," one of the men said, holding up the empty clip. "They use throwaway metal guides. Wasteful. Our clips are reusable." They laughed quietly, confident they were examining evidence of American extravagance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Italians lived by tradition. The Carcano system, refined from designs dating back to 1891. 6 rounds loaded through the top with a stripper guide. Bolt manually cycled between each shot. To them, this was the proven method. Reliable, simple, effective, when properly maintained. This American contraption, with its gas-operated mechanism and automatic ejection, seemed unnecessarily complex. Too many moving parts, too many failure points, too dependent on perfect ammunition. Marini wrote in his notebook, "Overweight, mechanically complicated, probably requires constant maintenance." He did not know that in the coming hours, those same conclusions would be turned on their head. In the makeshift canteen that afternoon, the conversation was predictable. Someone joked that the Americans probably needed automatic rifles because their soldiers were too poorly trained to work a bolt properly. Another remarked that such heavy weapons could only be carried by soldiers who'd never marched 40 kilometers in the North African heat. There was laughter. The laughter of men who still believed in the superiority of their own doctrine. None of them imagined that inside that scratched rifle was a design philosophy built not for elegance, but for dominance. The ability to overwhelm through firepower rather than precision. When they returned to the workshop, Marini stood beside the rifle again, studying the gas cylinder that ran beneath the barrel. He imagined the American soldier who had carried this weapon across an ocean, To him, the soldier was probably inexperienced, relying on automatic fire to compensate for lack of training. The Italian mind preferred the disciplined marksman. One well-aimed shot was worth 10 fired in panic. The idea that volume of fire could be more important than accuracy was almost offensive. He ordered a detailed analysis to begin the next morning. Tonight, they would photograph every component and prepare the test range. Technicians cleaned the bore with rags, revealing rifling still sharp despite hundreds of rounds fired. The barrel showed minimal wear. Marini frowned slightly. American steel must be decent quality, he admitted quietly. Yet every detail fit perfectly. The gas system aligned precisely with the bolt. The trigger mechanism, though simple, showed careful machining. The pattern unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. He chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he turned to his men. Tomorrow we see if it actually works under stress. Outside the arsenal, the sun set over occupied Sicily. The city lay in ruins under fuel shortages and Allied bombing, and the distant rumble of artillery grew closer each day. The irony was invisible to men who still believed traditional doctrine could win against industrial firepower. The narration slows as the camera moves closer to the rifle. Oil gleams on the operating rod, catching the fading light. The voice lowers. They were so sure, so certain that their refined bolt actions, perfected over 50 years, could never be surpassed. So sure that craftsmanship always defeated mass production, yet the numbers were already against them. Each American division carried over 10,000 of these rifles. Each factory built hundreds every day. And across the ocean, in a single year, the United States would produce more infantry rifles than Italy had manufactured in its entire war effort. But inside that ruined arsenal, no one knew. They were blinded by tradition, by the illusion that experience and careful engineering could overcome raw firepower. As the light faded for the evening, Marini looked once more at the rifle. Its worn stock and battle-scarred metal gleamed dully under the hanging lamp. He imagined testing it, proving its flaws, confirming the superiority of Italian design. He did not know that what he was about to discover was not the rifle's weakness, but the obsolescence of everything he believed. History would not remember his confidence, only the moment it shattered. The narrator closes the section with a reflective tone. They believed they were examining a captured enemy weapon. In truth, they were about to witness the weapon that had already made their own rifles obsolete. The next morning, the workshop was thick with humidity. Sweat beaded on foreheads as the engineers gathered under harsh electric light, powered by a struggling generator. The rifle had been cleaned overnight, every surface wiped down until the Parkerized finish showed through. For the first time, the complete M1 Garand could be seen in detail. A gas cylinder running the length beneath the barrel, an operating rod emerging from the front band, a trigger mechanism surprisingly simple for a semi-automatic design. The Italians gathered in cautious silence. What had seemed crude yesterday now looked purposeful in a way none of them could quite dismiss. Colonel Marini gave the order to begin the detailed inspection. Tools clinked against metal, springs were compressed and released. The bolt assembly came apart with surprising ease. Lieutenant Rossini steadied the gas cylinder under the lamp. 8 parts in the operating group, he muttered. That's it. 8 moving components for the entire automatic function. Another man laughed nervously. Our Carcano has fewer parts because it doesn't need automation. Simplicity is elegance. They didn't know yet that simplicity without firepower was just weakness dressed up as philosophy. As the team worked deeper, small discoveries began to accumulate. Every component, though manufactured separately, fit together with identical tolerances. Marini frowned. These parts all interchange, he murmured. A gas cylinder from one rifle fits perfectly on another, Rossini replied. If these came from different factories, they must all use identical standards, down to fractions of a millimeter. The older man said, nothing. He had spent years fighting to maintain consistency in Italian arsenals. Each facility had its own methods, its own minor variations, The idea that dozens of American factories scattered across a continent could produce perfectly interchangeable parts without individual fitting unsettled him deeply. They reached the operating rod next. When Marini removed it from the receiver, his breath caught. The rod was machined from a single piece of forged steel, mirror-polished where it contacted the gas piston. "Look at the surface finish," he said quietly. "No tool marks, no irregularities." He turned the rod slowly under the light. The bearing surfaces gleamed like jewels. "This level of precision," Rossini said slowly, "requires industrial machinery we don't have access to anymore." Marini looked closer. The rod's cam surfaces showed minimal wear despite obvious combat use. The Americans hadn't just built a functioning mechanism, they'd over-engineered it to survive abuse that would destroy lesser designs. "It's redundant engineering," one technician whispered, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "They built a rifle that expects to be treated roughly." By midday, the workshop reeked of gun oil and metal filings. The Italians had disassembled the entire rifle. Spread across the workbench were dozens of parts. Operating rod, bolt assembly, hammer, trigger group, follower rod, each piece individually numbered and tagged. Each component, when measured with calipers, fell within tolerances that Italian wartime production could no longer achieve. Marini ran his finger along the hammer surface. "Look at this heat treating," he said. "Case hardened, then precision ground. They don't cut corners even on secondary components." He flipped it over, pointing at the engagement surfaces. "Self-releasing design. When the action cycles, geometry does the work, not spring tension." The others exchanged uncertain glances. A junior engineer named Sergio Costa found something remarkable in the en-bloc clip system, a spring-loaded follower that automatically locked the bolt open after the last round was fired. He traced the mechanism through its cycle. "It signals empty automatically," he said. "The soldier doesn't need to count rounds or check. The rifle tells him." He looked up, eyes wide. "Colonel Marini, this means faster reloading under stress, no mental tracking required." The room went quiet. Marini leaned over the open receiver, staring at the clip guide rails machined directly into the steel. The Americans hadn't just created a semi-automatic rifle, they'd designed an entire system around keeping the soldier in the fight with minimum thought required. He thought of his own experience with the Carcano, 6 rounds loaded individually through a stripper guide. Bolt worked manually between each shot. Under stress, easy to lose count, easy to find yourself working an empty chamber while the enemy closed distance. This weapon eliminated those problems through mechanical intelligence. At 1400 hours, they took a break. The men stood in the doorway, smoking cigarettes, looking out at the damaged city. Palermo was dying. Allied control was inevitable, one of them said quietly. "If every American soldier carries one of these—" No one finished the thought. Marini stared at the distant harbour where ships burned, sending black smoke into the clear sky. He had heard reports from the front, stories of American units laying down continuous fire. Entire squads shooting without pause, without the rhythmic gaps that bolt actions created. He suddenly realized that sound wasn't exaggeration. It was 8 rounds fired as fast as a trigger could be pulled, multiplied by hundreds of rifles, creating a wall of bullets that made maneuver impossible. They returned to work with a strange new seriousness. By late afternoon, they had uncovered the gas system design. Marini expected a crude tap-off mechanism. Instead, he found an elegant solution. A precisely drilled port bled gas into a cylinder. The pressure drove a piston that pushed the operating rod rearward. When he rotated the gas cylinder plug, the mechanism moved with surgical smoothness. "It's self-regulating," Rossini said softly. "Gas pressure is metered by the port size. Too much powder, the excess vents. Too little, the piston still gets enough impulse." Marini's face hardened. Italian rifles had no such forgiveness. Ammunition quality mattered. Powder loads had to be consistent. Primers needed exact force. Any variation affected reliability. The Americans had engineered around human imperfection. At dusk, as the last measurements were recorded, Marini noticed a detail almost invisible under grime. A small stamped marking on the receiver. Springfield Armory, 1942. He realized this rifle had been built just 1 year ago, 1 year from factory to battlefield to captured examination. The production speed implied was staggering. He told his team to document every measurement. They photographed the gas system, the clip guide, the trigger assembly. Each image seemed to whisper the same message. This rifle was not designed by gunsmiths. It was designed by industrial engineers who understood warfare as a production problem, the ability to manufacture faster, deploy wider, and maintain easier. As they prepared to leave, Marini paused beside the reassembled rifle. Under the hanging lamps, the weapon looked less like a tool and more like a philosophy made steel. "They built this for soldiers who aren't marksmen," he said quietly. "For boys with 2 weeks of training who need to survive against professionals." And in that admission, the Americans had created something more dangerous than accuracy. They'd created overwhelming volume. No one spoke. They understood what he meant. The Italian army trained marksmen, men who could hit targets at 300 meters with careful aim. But training took time. Time Italy no longer had. The Americans had skipped that step. They'd given every soldier a weapon that turned trigger pulls into suppressive fire. The narrator's voice lowers, reflective and deliberate. That night, the Italians realized they weren't looking at just a rifle. They were looking at doctrine, one that valued firepower over precision, speed over elegance, pragmatism over tradition. It was the moment when doubt began to replace confidence. Across the ocean in Massachusetts, at the Springfield Armory, the same rifle that troubled Marini's team was being born again thousands of times over. The year was 1942, and the factory complex stretched across rolling hills outside the city. The air vibrated with the rhythm of industrial war. The thunder of drop forges, the whine of lathes, the hiss of heat-treating furnaces. To an observer standing in the main hall, it looked less like a gun factory and more like a living organism. Conveyor belts carried receiver forgings like blood cells. Overhead cranes moved barrel assemblies like muscle contractions, and each worker was another synapse in a vast mechanical brain designed for one purpose: build rifles faster than they could be destroyed. It was here that the Americans had perfected an idea the Italians could not grasp. That perfection meant not making flawless rifles, but making rifles that worked despite imperfection. The M1 Garand had been a gamble when it began. Too complex, too heavy, too dependent on gas pressure that could vary with ammunition. Early prototypes had malfunctioned during trials, jamming in mud, failing in cold, disappointing test officers who wanted reliability over innovation. But instead of abandoning it, the engineers redesigned it, again and again. They simplified the gas system, strengthened the operating rod, refined the clip ejection mechanism. Failure was not an ending. It was engineering data. Each problem was documented, corrected, and tested until the solution could be mass-produced. "We don't avoid problems," said one Springfield engineer in a 1943 memo. "We design around them." On the production floor, rifles moved through stations day and night. Each new receiver was forged from high-grade steel, machined to tolerance, then heat-treated until the metal could withstand pressures that would crack inferior alloys. The process was repeated hourly. When assembly ended, inspectors swarmed each rifle, measuring headspace down to thousandths of an inch. If a bolt didn't close smoothly, the entire rifle was pulled from the line. If a trigger broke at the wrong weight, the mechanism was replaced immediately. Every flaw became a lesson applied across every rifle being built that day. No committee debates, no waiting for authorization. Adaptation was automatic, industrial, relentless. Outside the assembly halls, another kind of precision ruled. Thousands of men and women, many who had never seen military service, worked in synchronized rhythm. Former machinists, housewives, college students, farmers who'd traded plows for calipers, all trained in the gospel of interchangeability. They didn't need to understand ballistics or infantry tactics. They only had to perfect their assigned operation. One man spent 8 hours a day milling gas cylinder ports. Another torqued exactly 16 screws on every trigger housing. By the end of each shift, their work joined thousands of other operations to create weapons none of them would ever fire. The Germans had master gunsmiths. The Americans had a nation of specialists. At the heart of the design philosophy was a single principle written in every training manual. A rifle that works imperfectly beats a rifle that doesn't work at all. Every system on the M1 Garand was designed for forgiveness. The gas system tolerated powder variations. The N-block clip accepted rounds loaded slightly off-center. Even the operating rod could function with minor damage to non-critical surfaces. New combat wasn't fought in armories. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit in frozen forests, or 100 degrees in Pacific jungles, perfection was impossible. What mattered was function. Rifles that could be dropped in mud, dragged through rivers, left in rain, and still fire when the trigger was pulled. The Italians would have called it tolerance for mediocrity. The Americans called it combat-ready design. On a February morning in 1943, a young inspector named Helen Crawford walked between proof barrels with a clipboard in hand. Rifles roared in front of her. Dozens of them, chained to test fixtures, firing endlessly against steel backstops. She paused at Station 7, where a receiver glowed faintly from heat. The barrel temperature gauge read 200 degrees. She checked the shot counter. 300 rounds continuous. No malfunctions. She smiled faintly, not from pride, but from relief. Every rifle that passed proof meant another soldier had a weapon that wouldn't fail him when seconds mattered. She initialed the inspection tag and moved to the next station. That signature, multiplied 100,000 times, was the invisible foundation of American firepower. Behind every rifle was also fear. Fear of losing sons. Fear of sending boys into battle with equipment that would betray them. Every engineer at Springfield Armory knew someone who had died carrying a weapon that jammed at the wrong moment. The redundancy wasn't born of luxury. It was born of grief. Every design improvement, every tolerance tightened, every test cycle added, was an answer to a death that had already happened. Every part in that rifle has a name behind it, one supervisor said in a staff meeting. Someone's brother paid for our knowledge. By mid-1943, the system had achieved something close to miracle. Industrial-scale production with artisan-level quality. 6 factories built identical rifles with parts that could swap between any unit ever made. A trigger housing from Massachusetts fit receivers from Illinois without adjustment. Gas cylinders from Connecticut threaded perfectly onto barrels from Pennsylvania. The statistical variation was smaller than Italy's best custom rifles. The irony was brutal. What the Italians worshipped as hand-fitted craftsmanship, America achieved through mathematics and discipline. The numbers told a story clearer than words. 5.4 million M1 Garands built by war's end. Average tolerance deviation, 3/10,000ths of an inch. Mean operational lifespan, over 50,000 rounds before replacement. Each could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute, each reloaded in under 3 seconds with a fresh clip. Each put 8 rounds downrange before the fastest bolt action could cycle 5 times. The rifle didn't just perform, it dominated. When reports came from Sicily that American units were overwhelming Italian positions through sheer volume of fire, the factory paused for 1 minute of silence, not mourning, but acknowledgement. They understood what it meant. The design had done its job. Every Italian squad pinned down by automatic fire validated the logic of semi-automatic rifles. As the narrator's tone deepens, we see the contrast. On one side, Italian tradition and careful marksmanship. On the other, American mass production and overwhelming firepower. The Springfield engineers didn't seek elegance, the voice says. They engineered victory through volume. In a conference room in mid-1943, as battles raged across Sicily, Army ordnance officers reviewed production reports. One colonel asked, "How do you measure success?" The lead engineer simply replied, "When untrained soldiers survive their first contact because they can shoot faster than they can think." That became the unspoken creed of American infantry. Later that year, the same philosophy crossed to every theatre. Europe, the Pacific, North Africa. Every front received the same rifle, the same training, the same doctrine printed on page 1. Shoot until the clip ejects. Reload. Shoot again. Don't aim for perfection. Aim for volume. Back in Sicily, the men examining the captured rifle had no idea they were holding a weapon born from thousands of invisible workers. Families, inspectors, engineers, toolmakers. They saw only steel and wood. But what they were really touching was the sum of every lesson America had learned about industrial warfare. That wars are won not by the best soldiers, but by the most soldiers shooting the most bullets. The voice slows. This was not a rifle of artistry. It was a rifle of arithmetic. It didn't demand excellence. It provided firepower. Not because marksmen never missed, but because missing mattered less when you could fire 8 times while the enemy fired twice. In the spring of 1943, before dawn touched the factory roofs in Massachusetts, the whistle blew, and thousands of workers began another 12-hour shift. They moved through the gates like soldiers without uniforms, lunch pails clanging against turnstiles. The smell of cutting oil and hot steel drifted over the parking lot, thick enough to taste. Inside Springfield Armory, lights burned around the clock, and the machines never stopped running. Each person who walked through those doors carried a simple faith. If they did their job right, someone they would never meet might survive to see home again. At Assembly Line 4, a woman named Dorothy Chen guided a reamer through a barrel blank. She was 24, a chemistry teacher before the war, who had traded lesson plans for machining tolerances. Her hands were steady, practiced, precise. Each barrel required exactly 47 seconds of reaming. She counted silently. The floor trembled with power. Drop forges shook the building like artillery. Sometimes, when the vibrations matched her heartbeat, she whispered the same words before each operation. Come home safe. It was her prayer for men she would never know, fighting in places she'd only seen in newsreels. A few stations down, a machinist named Robert Santos inspected receiver forgings under magnification. He was from Providence, a jeweler before the war, now supervising a team of 60 workers who produced parts faster than any Italian arsenal could imagine. When a reporter once asked him how he felt building rifles for boys barely old enough to shave, he replied simply, "You don't think about who carries it. You think about what happens if it fails them." Every component he approved carried that responsibility forward. One more weapon that refused to jam when life depended on it. In another corner of the plant, production manager Samuel Harrison stood on a steel catwalk, watching the lines move. Below him, sparks flew from grinders, and the rhythmic stamping of presses echoed like mechanical heartbeats. Harrison had lost his son at Kasserine Pass. 20 years old, carrying an early production M1 that had malfunctioned during combat. That memory shaped every decision he made since. He had turned grief into quality control. When contractors complained that proof testing every rifle doubled costs, Harrison told them flat, cheaper than telegrams to parents. When a supplier argued that gas port tolerances didn't need to be so tight, he said, "Tell that to the kid whose rifle jams." The narrator's voice lowers, turning from description to meaning. Each tolerance in that rifle had a face behind it. A mother, a machinist, a soldier's memory. A name written in the margins of quality reports. The story cuts briefly to the proof range at Springfield. 2 inspectors stand beside a rifle bolted to a test fixture, connected to pneumatic triggers and pressure gauges. They fire it remotely. The explosion of sound rattles windows across the building. Flames lick from the muzzle, blue and white, clean and controlled. The shot counter advances. 100, 200, 500 rounds, continuous. Oil pressure steady, gas system functioning. They nod to each other silently. Another weapon passes into service. Everywhere, the human element was the hidden machinery. Teenage apprentices degreased parts between shifts. Older men hand-fitted sear engagement surfaces. In the cafeteria, engineers argued over headspace measurements written on napkins. They weren't poets, but their poetry was tolerances measured in 10,000ths. They believed in the arithmetic of survival, that every interchangeable part, every proof test passed, every quality check performed was a promise to someone's son. The War Department filmed one production line for morale footage, but most was never shown publicly. It revealed nothing dramatic, just 1,000 quiet faces bent over their tasks. A voice off camera asked one woman what she was building. She didn't look up from her micrometer. "Something that doesn't quit when it matters," she said. The camera lingered on her hands, stained with cutting fluid, then faded to black. When word came back from the Mediterranean that American units were overwhelming Axis positions through firepower alone, the news spread across Springfield faster than shift changes. A rumor began. An entire Italian company had surrendered after encountering a single American platoon, not because they were surrounded, because they couldn't advance through the volume of fire. No one knew if it was true, but it didn't matter. It meant their work was translating into tactical advantage. That night, Harrison wrote in his personal log, "Our rifles speak because our people believe." The Germans and Italians who later examined captured weapons never saw this part of the equation. The sweat, the calloused hands, the exhaustion welded into every receiver forging. They measured springs and gas ports, but missed the meaning. Each component they dismissed as over-engineered was actually a reflection of something more powerful than craftsmanship. It was industrial empathy. The refusal to send someone's child into battle with a weapon that might fail. The narrator pauses, then concludes softly. Behind every instrument of war lies an invisible army. They don't sign blueprints or appear in victory photographs. They hold calipers, not medals. They build faith into metal. The morning the test began, Palermo was grey with smoke. Outside the makeshift range, dust swirled in hot wind. Inside the observation position, the captured M1 Garand stood on sandbags, positioned downrange at wooden targets. Its worn stock and battle-scarred metal gleamed under morning sun. Some expected it might fire a few rounds before jamming. No one expected what was about to happen. Colonel Marini stood before the firing line, stopwatch in hand. Around him, his engineers gathered in sweat-stained uniforms. A soldier from the local garrison had been selected to fire. Private Tommaso Bianchi, 22 years old, a Carcano rifleman who'd never touched a semi-automatic weapon. "Load when ready," Marini said. His voice was steady, but his hands fidgeted with the stopwatch. He had spent his life designing around limitations. Bolt actions required discipline, careful aim between shots, fire control through mechanical necessity. This American design removed those governors. It allowed shooting as fast as a finger could move. He had convinced himself that speed without precision was useless. That volume of fire meant wasted ammunition, and yet somewhere deep inside, a question had begun to whisper. What if overwhelming firepower mattered more than accuracy? The soldier pressed the N-block clip downward into the receiver. The clip locked with a metallic snap that echoed across the range. 8 rounds chambered in one motion, no individual loading, no counting cartridges. Bianchi shouldered the rifle awkwardly, unused to the weight. "Fire at your own pace," Marini ordered. "Show us what this weapon can do." The first shot cracked across the Tulea range, then immediately another, then another. The rhythm was shocking. No pause to cycle a bolt, no hands leaving the rifle, just continuous fire as fast as the trigger reset. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The entire clip expended in under 6 seconds, the empty clip ejected with a metallic ping. Bianchi stared at the rifle, stunned. Marini clicked the stopwatch. 5.8 seconds, 8 rounds, more than 1 round per second without losing sight picture. The engineers stood frozen. Lieutenant Rossini broke the silence. "Madonna Santa." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "He fired 8 times faster than I can cycle my Carcano 3 times." The narrator slows the pace, describing the moment with surgical precision. The air across the range shimmered with heat. Smoke drifted from the muzzle, hanging like evidence of something fundamental shifting. The metallic smell of burned powder mixed with dust, turning the observation post into a space between eras. Between the old warfare of careful shots and new warfare of volume, no one moved. Even the soldier stood motionless, rifle still at his shoulder, unable to process what his hands had just accomplished. Marini stepped forward, his boots crunching gravel. He could see the target downrange. 6 of 8 rounds had hit center mass, despite the soldier's inexperience with the weapon. Not because Bianchi was skilled, because the rifle required no skill, no bolt manipulation to disrupt aim, no hand movement to jar the sight picture, just point and press. 8 times before an enemy with a bolt action could fire 3. He pressed his hand against the rifle's barrel, feeling residual heat. The weapon was warm, but not hot. The gas system had distributed energy efficiently. The action had cycled cleanly without excessive force. It was no longer a captured trophy. It was proof of concept. After 5 minutes of silence, Marini gestured to reload. Again. This time, count the seconds yourself. Bianchi fumbled slightly with the second clip, but managed to seat it properly. The bolt slammed forward, chambering the first round. Fire, Marini said. The sequence repeated. 8 shots in 6 seconds. This time, 7 of 8 hit the target. The soldier was learning the sight picture, adapting to the recoil, finding the rhythm that semi-automatic fire created. By the third clip, he was firing 8 rounds in 5.2 seconds, with all 8 hitting within a man-sized target at 100 meters. Marini's jaw tightened as he watched an average soldier transform into a sustained fire platform. No special training, no years of marksmanship practice. Just mechanical advantage turning quantity into quality. Bring out the Carcano, he ordered quietly. One of the engineers retrieved a standard M1891 over 38 carbine from their equipment. Same soldier, same range, same target. Bianchi worked the bolt smoothly. He'd carried this rifle for 2 years. He fired 6 rounds, the maximum capacity. 12.3 seconds, half the rounds in the same time. And between each shot, his hands moved, his sight picture disrupted, his aim required reacquisition. The comparison was devastating. Marini did the mathematics in his head. In the time one Italian soldier with a Carcano fired 6 aimed shots, an American with a Garand fired 16. Nearly triple the rounds downrange. Even if American accuracy was lower, the sheer volume created overwhelming advantage. A squad of 8 Americans could produce the sustained fire of 24 Italians with bolt actions. The narrator's voice tightens as understanding spreads. For the first time, the Italians understood the secret that had eluded their doctrine since the war began. The Americans weren't trying to shoot better. They were shooting more, so much more that precision became secondary to presence. Every trigger pull was a vote for suppression over elimination. That night, after the soldiers left, Marini remained alone on the range. The captured Garand sat on the bench beside him, magazines of expended clips scattered like brass prophecies. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in his hand. Each breath of smoke carried the weight of realization. His doctrine, his training, his entire career had been built on a foundation that was crumbling. He thought of Italian squads armed with Carcanos. 6 rounds per rifle. Slow, methodical fire. Marksmanship emphasized over volume. It had worked in Ethiopia. It had worked in the Alps. But that was before they faced an enemy who valued different mathematics. He whispered to the silent weapon. You don't ask your soldiers to be better. You ask your rifle to shoot more. He imagined the American infantry advancing under fire. 8 rounds fired before taking cover. Reloaded in 2 seconds. 8 more rounds suppressing the next position. Every soldier a mobile base of fire. No need for aimed shots when aimed volume accomplished the same goal. Marini envied the simplicity. In his notebook, illuminated by moonlight, He wrote a single sentence. "We trained soldiers to shoot well. They trained rifles to shoot often." Then he closed the cover. The paper still carried the smell of cordite from his hands. The camera lingers on the Garand in silence. It sits motionless on the bench, but the viewer can almost hear it speaking. The narrator concludes softly. They came to test a captured weapon and discovered a revolution. They came to prove their superiority and found obsolescence. That day, tradition died, and modernity was born in fire and empty clips. The report reached Rome 2 weeks later, sealed in a canvas dispatch bag marked Urgente Militare. It passed from desk to desk through layers of bureaucracy until it reached the Army General Staff. Inside were pages of measurements, firing test results, and photographs of the American rifle disassembled on a workshop table. But one paragraph, written in Marini's careful pater handwriting, stood out like a wound. The M1 Garand allows untrained soldiers to achieve fire superiority through mechanical advantage alone. Rate of fire exceeds our standard rifles by factor of 3. Recommend immediate study of semi-automatic adoption. It was a single observation that undermined decades of Italian military doctrine. At a briefing room in the Palazzo Esercito, a group of senior officers gathered around a table. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and disbelief. One general read aloud from the report, his voice edged with irritation. 3 times the fire rate. Reload time under 3 seconds. Effective in untrained hands. He looked up. This is exaggeration. Combat hyperbole. Another officer, a colonel who'd fought in North Africa, adjusted his spectacles. No, Generale, the data is precise. I've seen it myself. American infantry don't pause between shots. The sound is continuous. It breaks formations. The room fell silent. They all knew what it meant. For decades, Italy had perfected the Carcano. 50+ years of refinement. Millions manufactured. Doctrine built around careful fire and ammunition conservation. They had trained marksmen, men who could hit targets at 400 meters with iron sights. But training took time. Time Italy no longer had. Resources Italy had exhausted. The Americans had skipped that entire problem. They'd given every soldier, trained or not, a weapon that created suppression through volume rather than precision. The narrator's voice lowers, deliberate and heavy. It was not skill that Italy lacked. It was the willingness to abandon tradition. They sought riflemen. America built fire platforms. A memorandum from the meeting survives in Italian military archives today. It records a remark from one general. If our infantry had weapons like these, Sicily might still be ours. But the comment led nowhere. There was no industrial capacity left to retool. No time to redesign rifles. No materials to mass-produce semi-automatics. The infrastructure that could have produced thousands of gas-operated rifles had been bombed into rubble by the very forces carrying Garands. What Marini's testing revealed was not just a tactical difference, it was a civilizational gap. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's production was accelerating beyond comprehension. Springfield Armory alone produced over 4 million Garands during the war. Winchester added hundreds of thousands more. The rifles flowed like an industrial river, 600 built per day by 1941, 800 per day by 1943. Each crate carrying the same promise: semi-automatic fire, 8 rounds, reload in seconds, service ready. The narrator shifts tone from analysis to scale. Italy fought with tradition. America fought with manufacturing. Every gas cylinder, every clip guide, every tolerance held to 3/10,000ths was part of doctrine, reliability through replication. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It meant when one rifle was captured, 10 more were already built. When one soldier fell, another took his Garand and kept firing. Italy's expertise was singular, America's was multiplicative. In August 1943, an Italian intelligence analyst compiled estimates of Allied small arms production. The numbers stunned him. over 4 million Garands by war's end, 14 million M1 carbines, production rate exceeding 2,000 infantry weapons per day. The report concluded with a phrase that would be underlined twice by reviewing officers. The enemy has achieved industrial immortality. We are fighting mathematics. Back in Sicily, Marini sat in the now abandoned arsenal, reading a copy of his own report returned with minimal comment. Outside, the Americans controlled the entire island. The irony was unbearable. He had tested a weapon that refused to stop firing, while his own army collapsed from lack of everything. For the first time, he understood the true nature of modern war. It wasn't about who built the best rifles. It was about who could keep building after everything else failed. He stared at a photograph from his test session. The Garand lying on sandbags, its action open, waiting for another clip. It reminded him of a machine that never tired. One system broken, another ready. That was America itself, a nation built on redundancy, on distributed production. Even if one factory fell, 10 others filled its place. His own country had no such depth. Italy's industry was concentrated, vulnerable, exhausted. As the narrator describes the final months of Italy's war, the tone becomes reflective, almost mournful. By the time Marini's discovery reached those who could act on it, Italy was negotiating surrender. You cannot redesign an army in the middle of collapse. What he had uncovered was not an American secret. It was the truth of industrial warfare. Victory belongs to those who can build faster than they can be destroyed. In his personal diary that September, Marini wrote, "We thought we were craftsmen of war. They were engineers of victory. Now I see which approach survives contact with reality." The narrator pauses, as if weighing the sentence against the sound of Allied tanks rolling through Italian streets. The lesson of the M1 Garand wasn't about mechanics. It was about philosophy. The Americans engineered for war as it was, chaotic, industrial, unforgiving. The Italians engineered for war as they wished it to be, precise, traditional, controlled by skill. And in that difference lay not just tactical defeat, but strategic obsolescence. The camera pans over archival images. American soldiers advancing through Italian towns, Garands at the ready. Then cuts to stacks of captured Carcano rifles, silent and obsolete. The contrast is absolute. If you believe strength comes not from precision but from the capacity to overwhelm, the narrator says, type 7 in the comments. His workshop was modest now, a small gunsmith's shop in a working-class neighborhood, the smell of oil and walnut wood, walls lined with antique rifles, including several Carcanos from his military service. On his workbench, among modern shotguns awaiting repair, sat a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the M1 Garand he had tested in Sicily. Somehow, through the chaos of surrender and occupation, he had kept it. The first entry in his wartime notebook was dated July 1943, Palermo. The last line on that page read, "We trained soldiers to shoot well. They trained rifles to shoot often." He had written those words the night he watched an untrained private fire faster than he thought possible. Since then, that rhythm had never left him. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he could hear it. 8 shots in 5 seconds. The mechanical certainty of a weapon that asked nothing of its user except the will to pull a trigger. It was no longer an enemy artifact. It was a reminder of what he had misunderstood his entire professional life. A young journalist from a firearms magazine had come to interview him. The man was polite, curious, maybe 30 years old. He asked about the war, about Italian rifle development, about the moment Marini realized American weapons were superior. Marini smiled faintly, cleaning his glasses. "They weren't superior in the way you think," he said. "Our Carcano was more accurate at range, lighter, simpler, but that didn't matter." He exhaled slowly. "They didn't build a better rifle. They built a better system. A rifle that made average soldiers effective." The journalist leaned forward. "Do you regret your service? Knowing what you know now?" Marini shook his head slowly. Regret is the wrong word. I regret that we learned nothing from the lesson. He paused, looking at the Garand in its box. We worshipped marksmanship, while volume of fire was rewriting combat. We preserved tradition while they pursued pragmatism. The narrator's voice replaces his, low and measured. History remembers victories, not revelations. But for one Italian engineer, revelation came not from triumph, but from the sound of a foreign rifle that fired faster than thought. Marini rose from his chair and crossed to the box. From it, he lifted the Garand, its metal cold and heavy in his hands. The finish was worn now, the wood darkened by decades of handling. He turned it slowly under the shop light. I kept this, he said. I thought it was proof of enemy capability. Now I think it was a lesson in humility. He placed it on the workbench beside a pristine Carcano carbine. The contrast was stark. Elegant Italian craftsmanship beside pragmatic American engineering. Which one wins a firefight? The journalist asked. The one that shoots more, Marini replied without hesitation. He told the journalist one final story, something he had never written, in official reports. After the test in Sicily, when the range was empty, he had fired the Garand himself. Not for data collection, but to understand what American infantry experienced. I fired all 8 rounds without thinking, he said quietly. Just pulled the trigger as fast as I could, then reloaded and did it again. 16 rounds in 12 seconds. He looked at his hands, remembering. For the first time in my career, I understood that warfare had changed. It wasn't about who could shoot best. It was about who could shoot most. That was the first honest conclusion I ever reached in uniform, Marini murmured. Outside, the sounds of modern Milan filtered through the window. Traffic. Construction. The noise of a nation rebuilt. Marini closed the box and said quietly, They built to dominate. We built to compete. The difference seems small, but one wins firefights, the other loses wars. The journalist wrote down every word. But when he looked up, Marini was staring at the photograph on his wall, a faded image of young Italian soldiers in Sicily, holding Carcanos, smiling before they knew what was coming. For a long moment, neither spoke. The narrator closes the story in the same calm documentary tone that opened it. The rifle he once tested sits today in a private collection in northern Italy. Its action still functions, its barrel still true. Tourists who see it in occasional exhibitions don't know that a man once stood before it and watched his entire understanding of warfare collapse in the span of 8 shots. They don't hear what he heard. The rhythm of semi-automatic fire beating louder than tradition. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.